gonna be explained in the midbrain videos. Now moving on, we have, in order for us to understand what's happening in the pons at the cross-section level, we're gonna have two levels in the pons. We're gonna have a lower level and we're gonna have an upper level. We have a caudal pons and we have the rostral pons. So remember guys, when we want to study the internal features of the pons, we have our golden thing, which is, if you guys look at the pons, all right, if you guys look at the pons, you have the tigmentum, which is the core. What is the golden phrase about the tigmentum? Lemnisci, cranial nerve nuclei. Perfect. Anteriorly, and that was posteriorly, all right? And anteriorly, what do you have? Stuff related to motor function. Remember you guys, in the medulla, we had pyramids, we had the motor corticospinal tracts, right? That was anterior, and the sensory stuff is posterior. Here we have the same thing, and in the midbrain, we have the same thing. If we are talking about a cross-section, remember that envision that in your mind. Remember that you have two parts. You have an anterior motor part and posterior sensory part. It's not only sensory, it does not have to be sensory. It's sensory when it comes to the lemnisci, but remember that we have also cranial nerve nuclei. So we have motor stuff anteriorly, and we have the core posteriorly, which is the tigmentum, and the tigmentum is lemnisci, cranial nerve nuclei. All right, now we are in the pons, and we have motor story here, and we're going to talk about that story. I'm leaving this to the end because it's a nice story, and once you know it, it's going to be very easy. Now let's talk about the tigmentum. What happens in the core of your pons? Remember, now we are moving from down to up, all right? And if we are moving from down to up, it means that we are done with the last four cranial nerves, and now here in the pons we have 5, 6, 7, and 8. And because we are at the lower level, it means cranial nerve nuclei of 6, 7, and 8. And in the higher level, I will see 5. And also 5 is going to be here as well. So 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so what do we have? What is number 6? It's your abducing nucleus. Remember the facial colliculus, guys? This is the tigmentum. So this is cranial nerve nuclei. So I'm expecting to see here nuclei of 5, 6, 7, and 8. All right? So, but 5 is going to be more prominent in the upper region. All right? Now, let's be here. What do we have? We have the abducing nucleus, and we have the facial nerve that winds around it and it exits. So that is creating my facial colliculus. All right. We have here in the very core the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This is the most medial group of axons we have in our bodies. So don't forget the place of the MLF. All right. It's gonna be here in the longitudinal most medial structure. All right, now other than that, what do we have? We have the vestibulocochlear nerve. So what do we have? We have the vestibular nuclei. Remember, we have the vestibular nuclei. All right. So in the tigmentum, you guys, in the tigmentum, you have your cranial nerve nuclei. We talked about 6, 7, and 8. All right, and you have the trapezoid body, which is actually the crossing fibers of the lateral lemniscus. Okay. I'm not sure why this is medial lemniscus, because trapezoid body is the crossing fibers of the lateral lemniscus. Okay, so trapezoid body is actually the crossing fiber of lateral lemniscus. Lateral lemniscus should be lateral here. I cannot see it. It might be in the upper level. Okay, so for here, you guys can see the cranial nerve nuclei. Other than that, what do we have? We have the cerebellar peduncles. Remember, you guys, in the first slide in the brainstem, I told you when you want to study the brainstem, you have to remember 3 things. Cerebellar peduncles, connections with the cerebellum, cranial nerve nuclei, lemnisci, right? Other than that, the descending motor tracts, all right? So what do we have? We have the superior cerebellar peduncle. Why do we have it here? Because remember, this one, guys. So the superior cerebellar peduncle is gonna show in the pons, and on top of that, you're gonna see the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, because here higher up you are in the pons, so you are expecting to see the superior cerebellar peduncle at pons and also in the midbrain. Okay, so here Coming back to this, we have the superior cerebellar peduncle because the cerebellum is there, you guys. This is the fourth ventricle, so the cerebellum is here. All right, so here the superior cerebellar peduncle. And on top of that is going to be the middle cerebellar peduncle, because remember, the middle is hugging the superior. So if we are posteriorly facing the cerebellum, it's stuff related to the cerebellum. If we are in the core, cranial nerve nuclei and lemnisci. If we are anteriorly, this is the story that we're going to talk about it now. Now, what is the story and the secret of the transverse spontane fibers? Yeah, it's a nice story. Okay, so what's going to happen is, if you guys look at the cortex is going to send the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. When they descend down, they're going to go down all the way through the crus cerebri and the midbrain. We're going to talk about that in the video of midbrain. And once they descend down, the group of fibers that will pass down the whole passage is going to be what we call the corticospinal tracts. If they can make themselves all the way to the spinal cord, we're going to call them corticospinal tracts. However, when they go there, they will find the pontine nuclei waiting for them. So the pontine nuclei are kind of sitting there in the pons, and they are kind of trying to catch as much as they can, because they want to take this information and cross it all the way to the cerebellum, because they want to control, because you guys, you want all the time to control everything happening in your body. So not only the cortex is sending fibers to the basal ganglia to ask about the movement, and they send them to the cerebellum, and we're going to talk about that in cerebellum, but also in the final tracts that they want to do movement, they will also send group of them down. They can go to the spinal cord, what we call the corticospinal tracts, but some of them will stop at the pontine nuclei, and they will be taken all the way to the cerebellum, because they want to check for this movement. And from here, you will have outputs controlling the spinal cord, and you will have outputs to the cortex. Okay? So what do we call these descending fibers? We call them corticonuclear. Why do we call that? Call them as such because they will stop at the pontine nuclei. So the corticonuclear fibers descending down, these fibers, they will stop at the pontine nuclei, and they will send what we call the transverse spontane fibers to the contralateral cerebellum, because they want to check for the movement and make sure that everything is perfectly executed. And from the cerebellum, they will receive the control to here and to up, and we're going to talk about the cerebellum later on. Okay, so what is the story now? The story is that if you guys can see nuclei, we call them pontine nuclei. If you can see transversely running fibers, we call them transverse pontine fibers. If you guys can see bundles of corticospinal tracts descending down, we call them the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. If you can see dots, we call them pontine nuclei. Okay? So, again, if I have transversely running fibers, these are the transverse pontine fibers that were redirected to the cerebellum to control the movement. If we can see bundles of axons going up and down in the cross section, they are the corticospinal and corticonuclear. The spinal, they could make themselves all the way down to the spinal cord. The nuclear are the group of axons and tracts that stopped at the dots, the pontine nuclei level. So the dots are the pontine nuclei. So this is the story that we can see in the basilar part of Pons. So if you look at the basilar part of Pons, it's basically your motor system. It's the motor control. It's anteriorly is the motor. So if I have axons running down, coming from the cerebral cortex, these are my corticospinal tracts. If they're gonna stop at the pontine nuclei and they're gonna run transversely to the cerebellum, so these are the pontine nuclei and these are the transverse pontine fibers. So the story, the whole story is all about the corticonuclear fibers that are going to be caught by the pontine nuclei and redirected to the cerebellum as transverse pontine fibers. And then this is the whole story. Three things: corticonuclear fibers descending and stopping at the nuclei, corticospinal fibers, they could make themselves all the way to the spinal cord. The second group is the pontine nuclei themselves, and then the last thing is your transverse pontine fibers. So this is what we can see in the anterior aspect of the pons. So in the black and white picture, all right, if you guys look at the pons, if you can see a very big thing, this is actually your middle cerebellar peduncle. If you can see a small thing, and this is actually hugging that, they are all facing back to the cerebellum. So this is middle cerebellar peduncle, this is superior cerebellar peduncle, this is your cerebellum, and this is your fourth ventricle, because this is your, remember that was your fourth ventricle here, the opening part, all right? And now the most medial structure is the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus. And if I can see something black deep here, this is the medial meniscus. Remember guys, when I told you to cut yourself into anterior motor part, and anteriorly you have the story of the three guys here, the corticospinal and corticonuclear that stopped at the pontine nuclei, and they were redirected through them into the transverse pontine fibers to go to the cerebellum. This is what you have anteriorly. Posteriorly, you have your tegmentum, and the tegmentum is nothing but the cranial nerve nuclei and lemnisci. I can see here the medial meniscus. There should be also lateral meniscus. It's going to be very prominent in the midbrain. And now let's look at the anterior story. If I can see cross-sectioned, if I can see black thing, it means this is axons. This is, in reality, it's white. So what are the things that were bundles of crossly cut fibers? This is the descending corticospinal or corticonuclear fibers. Perfect. Now, what are the black things that are moving transversely? These are transverse pontine fibers. I want you to see them once more. Can you guys see? Can you guys see these transversely black things? These are transverse pontine fibers. Now, if I showed you anything white anteriorly, this is going to be a nuclei, because white means something dark in reality. It means these are cell bodies. Okay, these are nuclei, group of cell bodies. So that is the whole story. If you guys look at it one more time, black things cut transversely, it means the descending corticospinal or corticonuclear fibers. Corticonuclear, they're going to stop at that level. If I can see white thing, it means pontine nuclei or pontine nuclei. If I can see black transversely running stuff, this is the transverse pontine fibers. All right, now this is the caudal level. Now what happens at the upper level? Remember, back to our story. 1 and 2, cerebral cortex. 3 and 4, midbrain. 5, 6, 7, and 8, pons. In the upper pons, 5. In the lower pons, 6, 7, and 8. So what am I expecting to see at the higher level of pons? It's gonna be my main sensory and motor nuclei of trigeminal nerve. And remember, the MLF is the most medial longitudinal fibers. And this is facing the cerebellum. So it's gonna be superior cerebellar peduncle. And the big hugging thing there is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And anteriorly, I have the story of the transverse pontine fibers, corticospinal and corticonuclear stuff. If I have dots, it means pontine nuclei. If I have transversely running fibers, transverse pontine fibers, I have the trapezoid body, which is the crossing fibers of lateral meniscus. I have medial meniscus laterally. All right, and then of course there will be reticular formation. If you have any gray matter in the center of your brainstem, that's going to be reticular formation. And the cranial nerve nuclei in my tegmentum here, it's going to be number 5. All right, so I think now it's easy for you guys to understand. Now what will happen if you look at these sections in the practical examination? To me, it looks like a head of a seal. So the pons, this is a very famous picture for pons. Other than the head of a seal, you guys, here you have the story that we talked about. You cannot miss it. There is no way you can get confused between pons and anything else, Why? Because if I have dots, white stuff, it means spontane nuclei. If I have black things going right and left, this is going to be the transverse spontane fibers. Can you guys see the transverse spontane fibers? It's going transversely. If I can see things cross-sectioned, a lot of fascicles and ascending and descending, this is going to be my bundles of descending corticospinal. Can you guys see all of these are actually a cross-sectioned longitudinally running fibers. Okay, so if I have fibers coming up and down and I take a cross section and I look at it, it will look to me like that. It has a lot of group of axons. Okay, so the story, if you guys can see, all of these circles are actually the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. Okay, so this is the Pons. Okay, there is no way we can be confused, because Pons has a very famous story and you guys know it. If you have something white, it means this is cell bodies in reality. This is the pontine nuclei. If you can see something going that's very long and going transversely, this is going to be the transverse pontine fibers. And once you cut yourself all the way into this motor part anteriorly and the tigmentum in the core, what you're going to have black, it's going to be medial meniscus. Lateral, it's going to be lateral meniscus. And if you guys see here, this is facing the cerebellum. So this is the superior cerebellar peduncle. So the continuation of the cerebellum is going to be your the decussation of superior cerebellar peduncle. And here, remember, the most medial core is the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and we're going to talk about that in a while. And so remember, so if you have something related to the fourth ventricle, you are posteriorly here. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle. This is the decussation of that. In the core, you have the lemnisci. What you can see is the medial meniscus and lateral meniscus. Okay,